So a while back, I made a video briefly arguing that American food is better than most people give it credit for. But I myself made a joke about American food, specifically about the Midwest. And a lot of people weren't happy about it. Okay, I get it. You guys are also proud of your food, and I didn't really respect that. Oh, okay, you wanna get off? I was trying to make a joke in the middle of what felt like a pretty serious video.
It's okay. You can laugh. It's funny.
Like, guys, I was kidding. And I never expected anyone in the entire world would ever defend Ohio. But this time, I want to give the Midwest the same genuine respect I gave to the rest of America. I'm gonna go state by state to find out if this country's food is actually a joke or not. Let's start with the states I've actually been to, beginning with Illinois. And you can't talk about Illinois without talking about the food of Chicago. I want to preface this because I do think Chicago is a great food city, but I'm not really a fan of the city's two iconic dishes, Chicago hot dogs and deep dish pizza. I won't get into deep dish pizza because I want to make a video about it in Chicago someday, so let's look at hot dogs instead. One thing that makes a Chicago hot dog unique is that the sausages are made of beef. If you didn't know, hot dogs are usually made out of pork. What also makes a Chicago hot dog is the poppy seed bun, and the toppings, which usually include mustards, onions, pickles, and tomato slices. But despite the range of toppings, adding ketchup is apparently a faux pas. I mean, this is why I don't really like Chicago hot dogs. There's way too many toppings, and the best topping for a hot dog is practically banned? But there is one way I think this style of hot dog works, and that's the Maxwell Street Polish. This sausage dish that's sort of a sister to Chicago hot dogs came from Polish immigrants who owned a hot dog stand in the historic Maxwell Street Market, a multicultural market that sadly no longer exists. But one of the market's legacy is this sausage dish, which is topped with green onions, mustard, and green peppers. Outside of Chicago, Illinois has some other dishes, most notably the horseshoe sandwich, which looks like this. Moving on is my favorite Midwestern state, Wisconsin. For Americans, it's obvious that cheese is a huge institution in this state. Wisconsin is home to 58 master cheesemakers. There are a ton of underrated types of cheese that have originated from here. Some are Colby cheese, brick cheese, and Limburger cheese. In fact, Wisconsin produces more cheese than Italy. This culture of Wisconsin definitely deserves its own video at some point, so I won't go any further. Instead, I want to talk about a few lesser known dishes like booyah, a stew made from broth that's usually slow cooked over the course of several days. This stew is usually made at home and eaten communally. It's often extremely thick with many different kinds of ingredients inside and has a very meaty flavor. This dish came to Wisconsin from Belgian immigrants, where a similar kind of stew exists, and it's one of many examples of European influence on the food of the Midwest. Another important culture of Wisconsin is beer. Not only does this state have some of the most exciting breweries today, the food here is often cooked with beer. From beer-battered cheese curds, onion rings, and fish, there is a unique culture here that also deserves some looking into for a future video. And speaking of drinks, if you're a fan of LaCroix, that's from Wisconsin. Next up is Indiana. Not much thought is often given to this state, but there are a handful of notable dishes from here. For one, the pork tenderloin sandwich, which is pretty popular in America, is often credited to Indiana. It's likely inspired by the schnitzel from Austrian and German immigrants. Indianapolis is also the birthplace of beef Manhattan, a dish that's inspired by open sandwiches in New York. It's apparently quite a huge deal in Indiana, so it's something I do kind of want to try. Finally, one of the most unique dishes here is the Indiana sugar cream pie. Oh god, I hate myself. A better name for it is Hoosier pie, and it's a pie made out of custard, vanilla cream, and cinnamon. It supposedly comes from Indiana's Quaker and Amish communities, who made the pie when they ran out of fruits and berries. While versions of this pie exist and come from all over the country, the Hoosier pie has become a staple of this region. This next state is the last one I've been to, Ohio. So let's look at some interesting dishes from here. Up north is Michigan. In Detroit alone, there's a few staple dishes here, from Coney Island hot dogs to Detroit-style pizza, which is influenced by Sicilian cuisine. Speaking of pizza, some of America's largest pizza chains come from Detroit, like Little Caesars and Domino's. Not sure if that last one is something to be proud of though. The rest of Michigan has all kinds of food brought over by European immigrants and adapted to American tastes. From Cornish pasties by British immigrants to this by Polish immigrants. Michigan is also the birthplace of the wet burrito, which looks like a big enchilada. Moving on, let's skim through the western states of the Midwest, beginning with Missouri. The state is home to two capitals for barbecue, St. Louis and Kansas City. These two cities have their own distinct styles. St. Louis's barbecue sauce is usually thinner and tangier than Kansas City, where the sauce is thicker and sweeter with a tomato base. But beyond barbecue, St. Louis actually has its own style of pizza. This pizza uses Provo cheese instead of mozzarella and comes with a paper-thin crust. Also, Missouri actually happens to be kind of overlooked when it comes to wine, as German Americans have developed wineries across the state in what is called the Missouri Rhineland. Next door is Kansas, which again has a lot of influence from German cuisine. One food to note here is Bierrock, a pastry that's basically a hot pocket of hamburger and cabbage. Also, there's a Kansas dirt cake, which looks like an Oreo tiramisu. I don't know, Kansas. Is there something I'm missing here? Like Kansas, Nebraska has a lot of influence from German food as well. Similar to the Bierrock, Nebraska has the runza. The filling for this is also pretty much ground beef and cabbage, but the bread pocket is noticeably different. Lincoln, Nebraska is also the birthplace of the deep fried cheese sandwich, which, again, I don't know if that's something to be proud of. Iowa is a difficult state to tackle. It's one of the most important agricultural states in the country, being the top producer of pork and corn. But for me, personally, the food here is kinda weird. Like, Iowa is apparently proud of some unhinged shit. Like taco pizza, cinnamon rolls with chili, ham balls, and all kinds of salads made out of snacks. There's a Snicker salad and a pretzel salad, and they're really proud of not having salads with vegetables. What am I supposed to say? Props to Iowa for not caring, I guess. With Minnesota, we can see a lot of European influence on the food of the Midwest again. For example, a big dish in this state is lutefisk, brought over by Norwegian immigrants. There are actually quite a few dishes here that come from Scandinavia. And again, there's a lot of German influence here as well. But none of these actually come from Minnesota, so let's look at the hot dish. I mentioned this in my joke about Midwestern food in my earlier video. And yeah, a tater tot casserole doesn't really make me hungry. But the history of it is actually a tribute to the resilience of the people in this area. The hot dish largely came from frugal housewives during the Great Depression, since it used little ingredients and is pretty filling with all of the carbs. And when food was rationed during World War II, this dish was solidified for being a cheap and resourceful dish when times were tough. And Minnesota loves their hot dish so much, they put it on their hot dogs, which is what a Minneapolis hot dog is. Beyond that, Minnesota punches above its weight with creating a lot of dishes. There's the pizza roll and the Juicy Lucy, which is a stuffed cheeseburger. I know, very American. Minnesota also happens to be one of the best states in the country for Southeast Asian food, because in the 70s, the state took in a lot of refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar, which is actually pretty cool. Finally, we have the Dakotas. Like Minnesota, North Dakota also has a lot of influences from Norwegian and German cuisine. However, from what I researched, most of the dishes that are popular in North Dakota don't really originate from there. To be honest, this state didn't really look too interesting to me in terms of unique dishes. But if you're from North Dakota and there's something that I missed, let me know in the comments. However, in South Dakota, there's a number of dishes to mention. The biggest food to highlight is probably chislik. I think that's how you pronounce it. This dish, again like so many others in the Midwest, was brought over by German and Russian immigrants, and is potentially derived from Turkish shish kebabs. Kuchen and kolaches are some other Central European foods that are pretty popular in this state as well. But what's most interesting to me are the dishes of the Lakota Sioux, native people who lived in where the state now exists. South Dakota happens to have a lot of relatively well-preserved traditions by Native Americans. There's wasna, a dish that's potentially an earlier form of pemmican, which is basically dried meat mixed with different types of grains or berries. The Lakota also had their own version of jam called wajapi. But most importantly, South Dakota is home to the Indian taco, a taco that's basically made with fry bread. If you didn't watch the previous video on American food, fry bread has a complex history between the US government and the Navajo Nation. Long story short, it's partially a symbol of colonization, but also a symbol of resilience. Indian tacos in South Dakota is very much an example of Native Americans taking ownership of a dish that represented a very dark history for them. Like in my previous video about American food, this cuisine is extremely diverse, and an interesting mix between the people that lived here and the people that came here. However, unlike the rest of the country, the Midwest isn't largely influenced by Western European or Asian cuisines. It's mostly Central and Eastern Europe that have planted culinary roots in this region, in particular the Germans. And it kind of shows us this trail of immigration into the US. The French, British, Italians, and Spanish have deep roots in this continent when it comes to food, but it's mostly within the eastern coastal areas or the border of Mexico. Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Koreans have roots in the West Coast. And for the Midwest, it's a mix of German, Czech, Russian, and Scandinavians who have created the cuisine here. So to all Europeans who shit on American food, I don't know, blame the Germans. Obviously, I was wrong to joke about Midwestern food without giving any actual facts. And it turns out that people in this region are proud of their food and their history, which at least deserves to be respected. Except Ohio.